The Dancing with Wisdom podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Dancing with Wisdom podcast with me, Snora Hager, as we continue to explore life and make sense of what is an increasingly cynical and confusing and complex world. Well, we're continuing our conversation with John Wyatt. John, great to have you with us.
Good. No, it's good to be here. Thanks, Sunil.
So, and these conversations with John are very much about friends talking about friendship, a subject that is not really given much attention in our day and age. We tend to look at it with either a degree of cynicism, and I'm just thinking a cynic is someone who knows the cost of everything but the value of nothing. And unfortunately, that's the way that our world looks at friendship. Or it looks at it with a degree of deep suspicion that something really dark and deadly and evil is going on. And in our last conversation, if you haven't listened to it, I encourage you to go to. We've in a sense laid out the groundwork for the positive side and how friendship is actually, it's part of being human. It's part of dancing with wisdom. We're called in terms of being, relating, doing, and leaving. And we are made for friendships, and healthy, good friendships can bring the best out of us and really make us more human. Well, in this conversation with John, we're going to explore, if you like, the darker side and really the mess that we're in when it comes to friendships. We like to think of ourselves as autonomous, self-made. I chart my own destiny. I know what's right and wrong, and I'm the best judge of where I should go. But John, that's a lie, isn't it? Really?
Well, it certainly is. I mean, we're all of us much more influenced by thinkers of the past and their ideas, and some of them very wonky
and not just 10, 20 years ago.
Indeed, hundreds of years ago. Many of the great thinkers of the past came up with ideas and concepts, and often, these ideas have a mixture of good and bad in them. Yes. But we've been deeply influenced by them. And I'm quite interested in what's sometimes called the history of ideas. How is it that the current things which seem so obvious and natural to us now, how did those ideas emerge? Yes. Where do they come from?
And in the last podcast, you talked about the hermeneutic of suspicion. Before you go, just explain to us what the hermeneutic of suspicion is. And then, if you like, give us there are obviously lots of people you could talk about, but I think you're going to give us sort of potted histoy with the main highlights from there. But let's start with the hermeneutic of suspicion. It's a long word.
We talked about it in the last podcast, but hermeneutics is an academic word which just basically means the analysis of a manuscript. That's where it starts from, and taking an ancient manuscript and trying to understand what does the author mean, the interpretation of a text. But it's also used about relationships. And so the hermeneutic of suspicion says, I wonder what's going on in that relationship, and I bet it isn't what's on the surface. In other words, don't just see the surface. There's two people enjoying one another. No, dig beneath, because there's something else going on.
In our culture, as it were, in the atmosphere that we live in today, there is this hermeneutic of suspicion. So, as we said in the last podcast, if two men have a close friendship, there must be something wrong,
something weird. There's something, we've got to dig beneath the surface. Yes. We've got to look beneath the surface, and we've got to be suspicious. Things are not, people say, oh, there's nothing, we're just good friends. Yeah, you don't believe that. That's that kind of attitude. So where do those ideas come from? Well, if you go back, to ideas of friendship, people have been writing about friendship for thousands of years. The ancient Greeks had this ideal of friendship, but it was a very positive thing. In fact, interestingly, friendship to the ancient Greeks was seen as something much more important than sex. Sex was just about reproduction or about some kind of physical pleasure, but friendship they celebrated as being something incredibly important. And much more important. So sometimes you hear the phrase a platonic friendship, that friendship which wasn't to do with sex. That was something that the ancients thought was the really most important part of life.
Yes, and it's something we said is even within the Bible. It's the importance and value of friendships and making us human.
Indeed, and it's one of the interesting things to me that there's been actually surprisingly little theological study about friendship. In the Bible, even though once you start looking for it, it's absolutely everywhere. And it's interesting, isn't it? Jesus said, greater love has no one than to lay down his life for his friends. And we read that with modern eyes. We think that's a bit weird. I mean, if he said, greater love than to lay down their life for their lover or for their child. Yes, we could understand that. But to lay down your life for your friend, that sounds a bit strange to our ears. And yet, in biblical thinking, friendship again, and even to talk about being a friend of God was seen as something immensely significant.
Yes.
So, I mean, just to fast forward very rapidly, there are certain figures who've really changed the way we understand relationships.
Yes.
And one of the most profound figures, which a name we've all heard of, is Freud, who was a Viennese doctor in the 19th century and who came up with some highly influential theories about how the human psyche works. And he thought of himself as a scientist. He was trained as a neurologist. He was very interested in the latest science. And he thought he was developing the science of personality. And the interesting thing is, he conceived of the way that human beings work as a bit like a steam engine.
Right. Seems a bit weird, but yeah.
The steam engine actually was at the time, this was the way that the most dramatic way of technology. And he conceived of something he called libido, which was basically sexual energy, as something was a bit like the steam of a steam engine. It was under pressure. It came bubbling up from deep inside, and it drove all the power. Everything that people did was ultimately driven by libido, by sexual desire.
So the primary desire for what we do is sexual, is what he said. Yeah.
But he said that what happens is that he also had this idea that this energy, if it burst out, it would be completely destructive, a bit like when a steam engine explodes.
Yes.
And so it had to be repressed. It had to be damped down. It had to be controlled. And he believed that the whole development of civilization and the cultural and the limits, and saying that you shouldn't have sex with these people and you should only have sex in marriage and so on, this is all to do with repression in order to allow civilization to work, to keep this desperately dangerous sexual energy, keep it within confines.
Yes.
And
this is over 100 years ago, he was saying.
It's over 100 years ago, and yet, those ideas...
in a very conservative culture at the time.
Yeah, indeed. And interestingly, these ideas, which have now been scientifically pretty much poo-pooed, and, there just isn't the evidence that libido is the single driving thing behind the scientific evidence isn't there. But this idea that sex is the most profound motivating force for
and look
human
at our
beings.
culture now. Look at it. I mean, sex is selling everything, advertising, and we look at all relationships as about being sexual, as well as our culture that's just driven by sexual identity and,
And also,
of all forms and sorts.
It is indeed. And interestingly, these ideas, and there are many other things apart from Freud which have fed into this. A lot of it is the commercialization of sex, the way that people discovered in the 1960s that sex could be used to sell anything, and that it was very powerful. And interestingly, it's also the loss of religion and religious belief, is that for many modern people, sex has taken the place as being the most profound, motivating
You had a very
force.
provocative quote from, is it Malcolm Muggeridge, isn't it, that I saw in one of the drafts of your book. Why don't you just tell us that? Yes.
Yes, the orgasm has replaced the cross as the ultimate meaning of life.
And tragically, I think, when you look at our society, I think you'd have to agree it probably has,
Well, and so this idea that in an orgasm you are finding the ultimate meaning of life, that would have been laughable to people in the ancient world, and yet to modern people, because
it's the pursuit of pleasure, isn't it? It's the pleasure, and it's the ultimate pleasurable experience. I
There's
suppose.
something about ecstasy. Ecstasy means literally to be taken out of yourself, and so people think that in this experience of being taken out of yourself, I'm discovering the ultimate meaning of what it means to be human.
Yes.
So sex is seen as driving relationships. So what is friendship about? Well, it's just covert sex. It's about getting some kind of sexual thrill, some kind of, it could be, if it's two men, it's homoerotic, or it's paedophilia. There's something. It's fundamentally sexual. That's
Yes.
the one.
And
big
that's so
idea.
endemic within our culture. You won't say it as directly as that, but everywhere you look, that's what keeps on coming up, as it were. About that's the meaning of everything, in a sense. Yeah.
Well, and of course, it's not complete rubbish. I mean, what these tragic scandals to do with, church leaders, with Roman Catholic priests, with teachers and
In all sorts of
headmasters,
areas.
with,
Yeah.
what it's told us is that sadly there is a great deal of sexual perversion and sexual abuse of children.
And that's about power as well, and exploitation. Yeah.
Yes, and that's the other side. So it's not just sex, but what other thinkers have brought in the ideas of is that it's much more to do with power. It's much more to do with the powerful oppressing the weak.
Yes.
And so we should always think in terms of power. And this is an idea you can really trace back to the philosopher Nietzsche, the German philosopher, who basically threw over a lot of the traditional understanding and said, look, ethics isn't about what's right and what's wrong. Ethics is about the powerful.
Yes.
Who are telling the weak what to do. Whenever somebody tells you what is right or wrong, they're really saying, I'm the powerful one,
right.
and I am here to impress my will on
Yes.
you. And so the will to power, the will
Yes.
to drive,
Yes.
to dominate.
And I'm just thinking, maybe they're reflecting in our COVID world as well, the power, about churches closing or not being wearing masks, getting you a vaccine. I mean, I don't want to go into the area about whether the ethics of that, but there's power play there as well.
Well, it is, and of course the response which we've seen across the world, but particularly in the States, that how dare you tell me how to live my life, and I'm free to. I don't want some politician telling me that I've got to wear a mask. I don't want some politician telling me that I've got to get vaccinated, that I've got to practice social distancing. I am free. I exert power over my own life. I am deeply suspicious of anyone else
telling me what to do.
Again, you can trace this idea back to these philosophical thinkers.
Yes. It's quite sobering, isn't it, that these philosophical thinkers who were hundreds of years ago are deeply influencing us now, even though we like to think that we are free thinkers.
It is interesting, and it comes out in so many different ways. If we think about films, about novels, about drama of all kinds, we think about advertising, we think about just the common popular culture, these ideas of sex and power as being the most important motivating forces behind human existence are very powerful. And therefore, when we come to friendship, it's not surprising that we should think, well, it's either sex or it's power or it's both.
Yes.
And again, it's not all wrong. I mean, sadly, friendship can go horribly wrong, and when it goes wrong, it often is along either sexual lines or along power abuse of power.
Yeah. So if we're going to look at our friendships with wisdom, which is really what we want to do, we need to be clear about what the warning signs are. In the last podcast, if you haven't listened to that, we talked about the very positive sense of the friendships with John Stott and the positive influence that had on lots of people for the good. We're looking here now on the negative. And if I'm going to live with wisdom, I'm got to really know what are the warning signs that actually this friendship is crossing some lines. And I need to be very careful. Maybe need to steer well away. Maybe need to talk to somebody else about this. Yeah.
And I think this is the real challenge. When I think back to the friendships I had as a student back in the 1970s, and it was a different world. We didn't know any of this, of course, abuse was a reality then, but the understanding of what the dangers could be and of how these relationships can get corrupted, we just didn't have. And when I look back on those relationships, it all seems rather naive and rather heedless. Whereas the real question we've got to ask ourselves, now we know what we know. Now we know about sexual abuse and we know about coercion and control and bad relationships. How can we act wisely? How can we reinvent friendship in the 21st century? How can we reinvent healthy and positive and wise friendship?
While we're aware of of the dangers as well. So, John, to give us some of the warning signs to look out for.
Yeah, well, I think what comes out is there are certain warning signs which we all need to try and understand of how friendships can go wrong. And just here are a few of them. It's not by any means exclusive list. I think in many of the accounts, there is what it sounds is that the powerful person has said, has demanded a kind of loyalty from the junior, the younger person. The powerful person says, I'm going to give you my friendship, but you've got to be loyal to me. I want you to be absolutely loyal. I don't want you to tell anybody else about what's going on in our friendship. I don't want you to tell anybody else about what I've said.
Yes.
I expect you to be completely and utterly loyal to me.
So it's sort of direct and indirect means that's communicated.
Yeah. And that should be a red flag. That's a warning sign.
Yeah. So this is an exclusive friendship between you and me.
Why is this person wanting me right from the beginning to be loyal? Is it? Yeah. And it's a sign that this person is already trying to establish a kind of control in an unhealthy way. So another thing is what is often described as love bombing, which is a sort of strange word, but what it basically means is when an older person, like for instance an older leader, speaks to is developing a friendship with a younger person and says, I think you're the most amazing person. I think you've got such amazing potential. Yeah. You're one of the most outstanding young people I've met, and I just want you to know that how special you are, and what an amazing person you are. And that if you hear someone saying that to you,
continually,
that
and
kind of over the top,
it sounds too good to be true,
over the top flattery, and which in your heart isn't true. I know I'm not something.
But we talked about earlier that there's real loneliness in the world. I think in the UK the figure is 22% of people say they feel lonely most of the time. Yeah. And it makes you very vulnerable.
It makes you very vulnerable, and we're all vulnerable to that kind of flattery
and the attention,
but love bombing should always be ringing warning bells. Why is this person being
too
so
rosy?
Over the top?
It's too rosy. Yeah. Obviously, it's good to encourage and say how we've been blessed and encouraged.
But it has to be honest. It has to be real.
In a context. In a context.
Genuine friendship is about reality. It's about sharing myself with all the positive and the negative. It's not about this illusion of being.
So you said demand for loyalty, this love bombing. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
I think when friendships, there's an element of fear creeps in. I mustn't do this because the other person would be angry, because they would take it out on me, because it would be, they said, "Where were you? I expected you. Why weren't you there?" And I'm starting to feel.
There's real insecurity there.
There's fear.
Yeah.
And what many people say is that this love bombing can suddenly shift,
Right.
So all of a sudden, I'm having this friendship and I'm saying, you're the most wonderful person I think, but there's something I absolutely think is terrible. And all of a sudden, I'm shifting from this
so positive
and
to
then
completely negative.
Very, very negative.
Completely negative.
And that is well recognized as one of the techniques that people do to use
to control
and to abuse. And again, that should be a warning sign. And I think finally the crossing of boundaries, that friendship, healthy friendship, always has some boundaries. It has some points at which we don't cross, and so. And obvious boundaries are sexual boundaries, about physical contact, about sexual stimulation, about undressing, there are boundaries about what a healthy friendship has.
Yes.
And at what point.
Yes.
And if you suddenly feel it's a bit uncomfortable,
too much,
why don't we have a cuddle? Why don't we? There's something. We're crossing a boundary here.
And I suppose the thing is, if you're putting somebody up on a pedestal, or you're respecting somebody because of their authority, their position, it's very hard in a sense to talk about, and it's very easy to feel that you have to go along because they know so much more than me, they're so much more senior to me, I mean, they might not just be age. They just in a different. They have more authority in their position in some way, or they're more charming or
That's
whatever.
absolutely right. And sadly, what we now recognise is this phenomenon of grooming that
Right.
the older, the abusive person, instead of just immediately
Yeah.
saying, why don't we have a sexual relationship? It's a very, very subtle, slowly,
And that's the
gradually
tragic thing, isn't it?
breaking down
Yeah.
the boundaries.
Yes.
That there's some kind of ulterior motive. This is
Yeah.
not genuine
Yeah.
friendship. There's an ulterior motive. It's transactional.
Yes.
I'm getting something out of this.
So as we look at with friendships with wisdom, it's obviously good to be intentional about friendships, to look for people who we can develop close, good friendships with. But we have to have our eyes open to the fact that there are, using Jesus' words, wolves in sheep's clothing. There are people who actually have set their heart and mind to do evil.
I'm afraid so. And also, sometimes it happens gradually. So a friendship can start off in a very healthy, positive way, and then bit by bit it starts to get corrupted, and these other elements, whether it's sexual or whether it's this sense of manipulation and power and control, it just goes wrong. And that's why I think this idea of red flags, of trying to recognize the red flags. So I think.
So, John, if somebody's watching this or listening to this now and they're thinking about a particular friendship they've got with somebody, what should we be saying to them? Do you think they're listening to this right now and they're feeling uncomfortable about a particular friendship and they're thinking, actually, I wonder if some boundaries have been crossed. I wonder if I have been love bombed. I wonder if there is this unhealthy use of power that's happening here. What do you think we should say?
I think the most important thing is to find somebody else outside the friendship who you trust and start talking about them. Even if the person said you mustn't tell anybody else, this is just between us, this is entirely confidential and you mustn't tell anybody else. I think we have to break that because that is wrong. One of the interesting things as a pediatrician, I know something about helping children who are at risk of being sexually abused and so on. And people often talk about good secrets and bad secrets. A good secret is when someone has shared something special with you, and you don't necessarily want to go and tell everybody. That's a good secret. But there are bad secrets. Bad secrets are where someone or a person is saying, we've got a special friendship, but you mustn't tell anybody else about us. And so in the same way, in a adult friendship, there are good secrets and there are bad secrets. And we need to understand the difference. And when there's a bad secret, we need to have the courage to find another trusted person.
So don't hold it for yourself.
Don't hold it because it's wrong to keep these things in the dark. And the point is, of course, the reason for that is partly because if I'm being abused, I need to recognize that. And get healing for myself from outside this relationship. But I've got to remember there could be other people as well. If I don't say anything, if I just say, well, I'll keep it to myself, okay, I'm not really happy about this. You don't know what other people, more vulnerable people out there, might be being abused as well.
And the tragic reality is that people, in the name of God, in the name of being church leaders, in the name of being religious leaders of other faiths as well, people in authority, have abused their power and used the right language, but actually their actions have actually betrayed something very, very sinister and very, very dark.
I'm afraid so. And that's why we can't be ignorant. We can't behave as though we're not.
We can't be
aware
naive.
Of all this.
We can't be naive about this.
And so I think one of the things I'm hoping to try and encourage us all, and myself included, is to be more reflective about our friendships. To think back. I've got this very close relationship. Here's somebody at church who I'm meeting up with, or whatever. Let's just reflect and think, are there any unhealthy aspects about this friendship? Are there things that I need to change? Are there boundaries that are being crossed?
Yes, and obviously a root of all this is in terms of where my ultimate hope and security comes from, because am I looking to God to fulfill the longings and desires of my heart, of which we have a huge number, and many of them conflict and are confusing even to us? But am I bringing that under the lordship of Christ and asking him to, as it were, filter and as it were, mold and change and transform me so that I can be literally a tool for his goodness in the world? Or am I actually looking for my own selfish self-gratification? And that's the real danger there.
It is. And because friendship is so powerful, it's such a powerful force for good.
Yes.
It can be so transformative.
Yes.
We shouldn't be surprised that when friendship goes wrong, it can be a very powerful force for evil. And so the answer is not to say, well, I don't want to get involved with friendship.
No.
But the answer is, how can I build up a really healthy friendships, but work out where it's going wrong?
Yeah. So as we sort of wrap up, John, you've got 3 points in terms of what healthy friendships are about, and they're sort of 3 nons, if you like. But tell us about that.
So I think there are 3 boundaries that healthy friendships. The first is that we've already talked about, they're not sexual. I mean, that is the difference between the one-to-one relationship between
and in a world that's so
sexually
obsessed, really, everything has to be about sex. And in a sense, we are so confused in our world that we're not even sure, let alone sex within marriage. It's sex with anybody, anytime, anywhere, any gender. It's
so we've confused.
That's our culture.
We've confused friendship and sexuality, and actually, healthy wisdom sees these as being separate things, and that healthy friendships, are asexual, non-sexual. Secondly, that they are non-exclusive. So again, in Christian thinking, sexuality is something that it's one man committed to one woman for life. Friendships are not like that.
That's right,
So that whereas I can have this incredible friendship with you, in no way does that limit me from having a completely different friendship with somebody else.
Or bringing another person in.
Or bringing a person into the friendship,
Yes.
So whenever a friendship becomes just me and you.
Yes, just special friends kind of thing,
There's something wrong. So it's non-sexual, non-exclusive, and thirdly, non-coercive, that I am not using this friendship to try and get you to do anything.
Yes.
I'm simply wanting to share myself. And, if I'm a Christian, I'm wanting to share what God has given me. And to
but
share
I'm not
Christ
forcing you. You must listen to me. You must listen to me. We've got to have this together. And I need your time. And I really need you to be with me.
Exactly.
Yeah, because God's not like that.
Absolutely. And Jesus isn't like that.
Yes.
And therefore, as we model to one another, we model this service, this gentleness, and this humility.
So non-sexual, non-exclusive, and non-coercive. Yeah. That's very helpful. And there's a lot of depth and richness to that. And I think ultimately we see that in our relationship with God, because he ultimately is the ultimate friend.
But what I would want to say positively is that positive, healthy friendships, as one put it from a Christian point of view, are crafted out of the heart of the gospel.
Yes.
And so maybe that's something we can talk about.
And we'll talk about that in our next podcast. But thank you again, John, for really opening this up with us and helping us to grow wise in our friendships, seeing the great potential they have, but also the great dangers they are if we don't, as it were, have that discernment and prudence about the way that we go about our friendships. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Dancing with Wisdom podcast, presented by Sunil Raheja. For details on the Dancing with Wisdom book and its accompanying workbook, please visit drsunil.com. If you know someone who would enjoy this podcast, then please share it, give it a thumbs up on YouTube, and help it grow by leaving a nice review. Life's challenges can diminish, define, or develop you. Which will it be? Make sure you hunger for the wise one. The choice is yours.